Hi there, my name is Joe Peak. I'm head of supply chain at Windward. I've been with the company for 3 years now. Was part of the was part of the build of this module and this product that we're actually going to live demonstrate to you today. So something very, very close to my heart, but also I've worked alongside BCOs and also in freight forwarding for many years. So the problem of detention demurrage is something that I have a few war stories about, so I'm happy to be joined by Lars and Bjorn this morning as well to try and tackle this very very big topic. Um, we are going to follow the Chatham House rule, okay? And also, I do just implore everyone to ask questions. There should be a box on the right hand side of your Zoom. Please feel free to ask anything as we go. It's very very rare that you get Lars and Bjorn, the titans of containerized cargo in one call, right? So let's use this time. I'm going to learn a lot. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to stop them halfway between their sentences as well. So I hope that you do too. In some of our preparation work for this, we were talking to Bjorn, who sort of described this as a black hole from the BCO perspective, and Lars as a silent killer. I'm going to hand over to both of them to introduce themselves. They'll do a better job than me, but I was doing a bit of research on the Jensen surname, and it just means son of Jens. So is it that literal, gentlemen? Are you both the son of Jens?
Somewhere back in the day, I guess. Not many generations back. I have a family tree that I've actually managed to take back to 1582, but the
Okay.
Jensen disappears about two generations back, and it becomes all kinds of exotic, not very exotic, but by Danish standards, exotic names. But
Yeah.
yes, it is that simple in theory.
The son of Jens. Well, Bjorn,
Yeah.
seeing as you're speaking, why don't you just give us a quick overview of yourself and sort of the persona that you'll be taking on for this discussion?
Right. Most of the listeners here probably are following both the Jensens here, so I'm not going to run through the whole resume. You can find it on LinkedIn if you haven't already. Um, I currently work for EasySpeed Global Logistics as the global head of transportation, a new freight forwarder on the firmament of freight forwarders. And I'm not going to use this as a sales platform at all. In fact, the persona I'm taking on here today
Yeah.
is probably the BCO persona that most people know me for, with my 16 years of running global container transport for Electrolux and my close to 2 years of doing the same thing for Cummins,
Yeah.
as well as the many years I've spent but some years I've spent as a consultant, mainly to BCOs on the ocean freight, including detention and demurrage. So that's the hat I'm wearing today.
Very good. In my notes, Bjorn, it says that you've had 40 years of experience in the industry, but you've just had a birthday. So can we call it 41 years? I guess that's what we're working with.
Yeah, I started as a 3-year-old shipping prodigy. Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, I started my career in shipping in 1986 in the Maersk Shipping School. And after some years as a carrier, tried my hand at freight forwarding, moved on to the BCO side, did some consulting, went back to BCO, and now I'm trying my hand at freight forwarding again, sort of full circle.
Very good.
No plans of returning all the way full circle to a carrier. I'm convinced that not many of them would have me anyway. That's okay.
Well,
It's
thanks
fine.
for joining. Thanks, Bjorn. I look forward to it. Lars, what about yourself? Just give us a couple of sentences on who you are, what you do. That'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just a humble analyst in the container shipping sector. I mean, I've been independent now for 14 years, and the only thing I basically spent my time on is looking at this industry and figuring out what is going on,
Yeah.
and then sometimes playing the guy with the crystal ball, saying what's going to come down the path. And I'm lucky enough that at least some of all the stakeholders out there like to listen to what I'm saying.
Very, very good. Thanks, Lars. Thanks for joining. I know that everyone's in a different part of the world, so that's great. Um, it's interesting to see like the participants that we have on the call because there's a whole varied array of like different personas and verticals that are interested in this topic. Anything from forwarding, BCOs, large importers. We've also got some carriers, but also people that are commodity trading and also just shipping metals and metal traders. So anything as it relates to the box, right? And the problem with the box when it gets to detention demurrage. So yeah, looking forward to it. I also wanted to, because she doesn't have a round circle face on this slide, but my colleague Emma Crumpton, who is the resident expert of freight forwarding and just an all-round good person, she'll actually be taking us through our new module, right? So very shamelessly, we are going to demonstrate that. Emma, are you there? Do you want to say a quick hello?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Joe. Good to be here today. As Joe said, I'm going to take on the role of walking us through the new module and how we've been interacting with our clients with it. I've been with Windward for coming up to 3 years, and I worked with freight forwarding for 10 years prior to this. And now, as with Joe, worked very closely on this product with the product team. So it's something that's very close to my heart, and also have many war stories around detention and demurrage. So good to be here.
Great. Thanks, Emma. We'll come back to you very, very shortly. So just a quick minute, I guess, on Windward, if those of you that are attending today and taking part don't know who we are. We're a leading maritime artificial intelligence company. We've been doing this for close to 15 years. Just yesterday, actually, we were taken private again by our growth partner, FTV. So a very, very exciting time within the organization, and a very, very proud moment in the company's history. We do work across multiple different sectors and verticals. So we do serve the government domain. We protect borders. We help ministries of defense with understanding deceptive shipping practices and where the risks are and where they're laying within their territorial waters. We also work alongside trading and shipping companies, those that are shipping large amounts of oil and petrochemicals, the likes of Exxon, BP, Shell. So we're a world leader in sanctions compliance and following the regulations as it relates to shipping goods. The topic that we're going to discuss today, the one that myself and Emma work in, is actually logistics and supply chain. It's one of our newest verticals at Windward, and we've been working across all of the product development in this domain, primarily servicing freight forwarders and also BCOs. Okay, so when we're going to discuss the detention demurrage topic, it was very much released through our own customer feedback. Okay, so everything that we try and build within Windward is very much customer centric, and the problem of detention demurrage was one that we heard far too often not to do something about it. So that's what we'll be demonstrating to you very, very shortly. I'm going to stop sharing just so we can all see the panel's faces. I want to get into the problem statement of detention demurrage. It's a huge $100 billion problem if you were to put a price tag on it, and maybe we can't. But I want to start very, very broad before we get into the nuances and the challenges of each persona as it relates to D&D. So I want to ask Lars, you've done a lot of work on the Red Sea crisis and the geopolitical challenges, but at a high level, what sort of geopolitical things play into the role of D&D and complicate the matter?
What typically tends to play into detention and demurrage from geopolitics is whenever this gives rise to congestion problems, especially in ports and terminals, because that is what tends to throw a spanner into the works. Once you start getting these congestion problems, you have issues in terms of picking up your containers in a timely fashion. You have issues returning your containers in a timely fashion. It has ripple effects in terms of road and rail and land. And uniquely to the US, you've got the chassis issues racking on top of that. So it's not the geopolitical challenges in themselves that has a D&D impact, but it's the ripple effect that leads into port congestion issues.
Sure. And just specifically on the Red Sea then, there's been huge unpredictability on scheduling, and that's had a massive knock-on effect on congestion. I've always read sort of the opportunity that some ports had in sort of Southern Africa around the rerouting capabilities of containerized cargo, but they weren't quite ready, and we saw a huge influx of detention, demurrage, and congestion. Any other thoughts on that, on how the Red Sea has affected us?
I would see in terms of detention and demurrage and the Red Sea, we haven't seen nothing yet. I mean, sure, there was a lot of disruption when the Red Sea crisis erupted. Yes, you had some challenges because no, it's not really viable to send a lot of cargo this way and use the South African ports. They're just too inefficient for much use.
Yeah.
But the real killer here, and that everybody should be prepared for, is actually that happy circumstance in the future when the Red Sea reopens. Because when the Red Sea reopens, you're going to have such a barrage of cargo coming into, especially Europe, to some degree, US East Coast, but Europe is going to be the key choke point. And this is going to be an enormous problem, also related to detention and demurrage. This is something that everybody should have a contingency plan ready for. Now, it's not going to happen today or tomorrow, especially not with the way the Red Sea developments have gone over the last week. But eventually, this will happen, and it's a matter of preparing for it.
It does seem, though, from what you read in sort of the recent press and actually some of the insights that you provide on LinkedIn, it kind of shows no signs of abating, right? But I guess what you're saying is, are people prepared and ready enough for when it does abate?
I don't think so. That's at least not my take on it. I think I've come to the point where, sure, a lot of especially BCOs are realizing, yes, this will be quite problematic when the Red Sea reopens.
Yeah.
But are they tangibly planning for it? Not really the way I see it.
Well, so Bjorn, you're the resident BCO for this discussion. I mean, are they prepared? What types of things are people trying to put in place to get ready for it?
Listen, I don't think BCOs are prepared to deal with demurrage when everything is going well. And I definitely don't believe that they are prepared for what will happen when the Red Sea reopens. I think there's an increasingly widespread awareness that this chaos will materialize. And Lars has a big part of the credit for spreading that around the world by his God knows how many 130,000 followers multiplied by their followers. But I'm also not really sure how a BCO would go about preparing for it. If you're preparing for something, attempting to prepare for something you don't understand very deeply in the first place, something you already react to even on a good day, and for something that you don't know whether or when will materialize. I'm not really sure how a BCO will go about planning for it, other than building the awareness within the senior management to whom these BCO logisticians report that this will happen. And perhaps budget for it is the only thing that you could do to prepare for it. On the other hand, I don't know many BCOs who even budget for demurrage and detention at all.
In any event, right?
No.
Exactly.
So really, I think the level of preparedness is woefully low, but the level of awareness is increasing and probably quite high.
Do you have any like specific examples of when the impact of D&D is kind of like run away with a BCO? Like perhaps COVID, maybe it's the Red Sea, maybe it wasn't a geopolitical event at all, but like, can you explain or describe events that lead up to just the charge just getting wildly out of control?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the only one so far hasn't used the phrase war stories on this call, but I have many of my own. I have demurrage and detention to begin with among many BCOs, and here I'm talking not just about the ones I worked for, but also the ones I consulted for.
Yeah,
it's very poorly understood. I'd venture to say that quite a lot of BCOs, if you wake them up at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, quick, to explain the difference between detention and demurrage and port storage, would not be able to answer.
right.
For them, it's all demurrage. Typically, they all think it's demurrage. What they refer to is the cost of holding on to a box longer than you should, or exceeding your free time in whatever element in the supply chain. But it's not well understood at all. It's also in some cases, even if it is understood that there will be a cost associated with holding on to a box or exceeding your free time here or there or in all three places, it can be used deliberately as well.
Sure.
When I say deliberately, there are two ways of that being used deliberately within a BCO environment. One is the one where you report up to top management. We have a temporary glut of cargo. We've placed an enormous order. It's coming in. Our warehouses don't have enough doors to offload all these containers or strip all these containers within the free time, and for that matter, enough space to hold it, even if we had enough doors. So we have two options. One is to create an overflow warehouse with all its attendant problems in terms of FIFO control and just general operational control. The other one is to just leave these boxes to stand in the yard. And yes, we know that's going to cost us some money, but it's cheaper, or so they claim, than to create the whole overflow warehouse setup. Sometimes that's a deliberate calculation. Sometimes that's just reported up with a proper business case, with a proper calculation around it. In my experience, extensive experience, these instances are exceedingly rare. I've seen not many. What I have seen is a situation where the problem just begins in a small way, and then it just piles up, no pun intended, or pun intended maybe, it piles up in the yard, as it were, and it gets out of control, and FIFO goes completely out the door, and you start incurring really, really serious amounts of money in especially detention. I think Demurrage is not the biggest problem. Port storage is not the biggest problem. The biggest chunk of money is really on detention, and I hope that you've seen the same thing in your research. Right?
No. It's fascinating, and some of the use cases that we're working with BCOs on is, how do they get better oversight of that detention piece? I agree with you. The demurrage piece is probably less of an issue, but the floating warehouse space, right, of detention, and playing that off like other key rent payments or putting that out into another container yard.
If I can just add to what Bjorn was mentioning, that there's also another complication. One thing is understanding what detention and demurrage actually is. Another thing is understanding the network of people involved in moving that box. Because it's not just the BCO saying, okay, now I need to return it. They need to talk to somebody that brings a truck. That truck needs to, in the US, have a chassis. Then they need to have an appointment down at the terminal. And this is where things especially became difficult during COVID times, because suddenly the trucker was met by a requirement in the port. If you're going to come down here to redeliver an empty, you need to have a back-to-back booking, picking up somebody else's container. And then everything becomes enormously complicated.
Yeah. I think so. I appreciate you mentioned that, Lars. I think as part of the demonstration, we're going to lean into like, how do different actors within the supply chain take ownership of this type of problem, both in the forwarding, the BCO, whatever standpoint they have or whatever position they have in the value chain. I think what we're finding is that it's a very, very complicated world, both to understand how the tariff is applied, how you actually calculate these charges, but then also how do you respond and react and remain agile when a box is actually stuck somewhere, right? How do you get alerted? How does someone actually take action and take ownership over that? It's a really good point. I wanted to just, before moving on to like technology and the role of technology here, I think we've seen some positive regulatory changes and massive negative ones. I wanted to start with positive. So the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, OSRA, what are your guys' thoughts on that? I mean, does it go far enough? Are we seeing that there's been a positive impact with OSRA?
My view on that one is it was difficult beforehand with the old OSRA. This is a matter of the blame game. Who is responsible for what? Right. With the new OSRA, I just see a different blame game. I still see the same fundamental problems. You just change the blame game.
Yeah. And opened up another Pandora's box of people trying to create workarounds in the new blame game, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the buck always gets passed on, and everything is a business's black hole that I refer to the whole problem as, right? I don't think many shippers would be able to explain to you the differences, right? It's clear that, and the FMC has handed down some rulings to that effect, that there have been very unfair practices from carriers, or rather from carriers, it would seem, right? But we don't know where those unfair charges really originated.
Right.
But for sure, there have been cases, especially during the pandemic. But let's be honest, demurrage, maybe not so much, but definitely detention is also another revenue stream, and or implicitly profit stream for carriers and in certain cases forwarders as well, right? Yeah. It's not always true. It is held to be true that carriers impose detention as a stick with which to beat BCOs into returning empty containers. But it's not always true that that carriers necessarily want those containers back right away, especially if they can charge detention on them while somebody else is providing the storage.
Right.
It's not always true, right?
Yeah.
But
Maybe a nuance there.
tinkering with very, very significant revenue streams here. Whether you create a new OSRA, whether you create a system, you're tinkering with huge streams of money.
Yeah.
And you say maybe a nuance, at least that I find curious in this whole debacle over recent years. It appears to me, and let me know, Bjorn, if you see it differently, but it appears to me that this is especially a hot topic in the US. And in the US, there is very much a focus on that somehow this is the evil carriers trying to extort the situation. But I have the view, if this was the carriers, this should be the same issue all around the world, and it is not. It seems to me that the core of the problem, of course, the carriers are not without blame, of course they're not, but this is also rooted in the extremely complex and not very efficient setup on how the supply chain works, specifically in the US.
Sure.
Completely agree.
I think just continuing on that thought, I think there's just a perfect storm brewing with what's going on in the US. I mean, USTR, regulatory changes, job cuts with Doge, there's tariffs going to be implemented very, very soon. Is the US ready for that? Like, in my eyes, with the concoction of what that is, knowing how complex the problem is, it feels like we're sort of like sleepwalking into a D&D major problem.
Oh, yeah.
Let me be extremely diplomatic. I would say with USTR and all the other ones, it seems that there is no one at the helm that has the slightest clue how the supply chain works. The best, if we're talking specifically D&D, the best you can hope for is that nobody in Washington gets the bright idea to touch that one right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So okay, it's painful, it's costly, it's complex. We agree on the problem. I want to talk about the role of technology. Obviously, we're going to get into our Gen AI native solution around how we handle and tackle the problem of detention demurrage, and also how we handle the contractual complexities of it as well. But let's start with just the status quo. Like, how is it managed today, Bjorn, mainly? How have you seen it being managed on the BCO side? Is this a spreadsheet? Is this a manual thing? Like, give us some insights there.
I'm not going to sit here and say that there aren't BCOs on this call who are not, 100% on top of this, although I would guess that if they really were, they wouldn't be on this call.
Yeah.
In my experience, it's not managed at all. The process of managing demurrage and detention is something like receive invoice, pass invoice to payment, pay invoice. As I sit here and I've obviously followed your development and worked with Windward over years, the excitement from a BCO's perspective here of technology is to finally, without having to do much work, getting an answer to what, where, why, and how much. Because I think the dirty secret of BCOs is none of us knows how much we're really paying on a global level. We know that it's rather large, but we only see the big ones where we have no choice but to intervene. There is a massive dark number within any BCO of any reasonable size, massive dark number where these charges are small enough that they disappear into individual plants or distribution centers, slush fund, and they just sort of go away. Right, but when you, but it's a 1,000 little streams make one big river, and there's no BCO that I know of today who has any visibility to how big that river is, or indeed where the streams are coming from.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we find is that if we stick with the BCO use case, that sort of the unpaid accounts payable back to the carrier, or verifying or auditing that the carrier's invoice is actually, or the forwarder's invoice is actually accurate. And what we find is that some BCOs just pass it, like don't even review it, or they pass it within a threshold, and like the revenue leakage there is very, very significant. But also I find it interesting that on the BCO side, they will
audit to the nth degree the freight rate, right? But this unplanned fee of detention or demurrage just kind of like falls by the wayside and just flies under the radar. Yeah.
It does, because they are sort of relative. I mean, you audit what you can, right? The fact is that up until today, I've yet to see a system, until hopefully we shall see one shortly, yet to see one that can actually give you answers. And I'm not even sure your tool, as good as it is, and I'm sure it is, can give you all the answers. I think the day when every container is GPS equipped and has perhaps a few other sensors, and there's a proper tool with which to use that data, maybe then we will have at least an answer to what happened to the container. I think, to Lars's point, especially in the US, I think we will still struggle to sort the wheat from the chaff in terms of whose fault it was, and therefore whether this bill is fair or not. So I think there's just a tendency on BCO side to say, well, freight rates, the invoice itself, that's auditable. Here we know that something moved. We have a bill of lading that proves it moved. We know when it arrived. Therefore, we know which particular tariff and which particular bunker and so on to apply. We know where it came from. We know what the terminal ending. These are easy to audit. Demurrage detention it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
When you make effort as a BCO, and these are the war stories that I have and the scars that I carry, is when a problem grows so huge that a factory or a plant or warehouse or DC or somebody can no longer sweep it under the carpet because the slush fund will not take care of it. And you have no choice but to go higher up to people like me and say, hey, I've got a little bit of problem. It's a $12 million problem, by the way. That's a real number that I've had. We have a $12 million problem. We have a $1.2 million problem. I've had problems of that magnitude on my hands. I know one European BCO, retailer who shall remain nameless, who had a $235 million detention problem in Europe alone, created by COVID. So these numbers, these are the ones we see. Right. That's when we start taking an interest, because we have no choice.
And you can say potentially with the risk of derailing the conversation slightly, but as we get more and more data and data insights, that, at least from my perspective, would hopefully open for different ways of solving this. Instead of looking at D&D on a per container level, why is it we haven't already gone down the path and say, fine, if I'm moving 10,000 containers a year, in principle, I got, say, 10 days of free time. Great, I got 10,000 days of free time. If I then choose to spend a lot of them on 5 containers that stand for a year, but the rest of them are delivered within 3 days, I should be all good. Then we get rid of all these small nitty-gritty things. Now, of course, that would be in a BCO interest. Then there's the other coin, the flip side of the coin, where obviously for the carriers, this is a revenue stream. This is a business model for them. So that will need to be thought through. But I think increased data awareness could open the path for models like those.
Do you think that the carriers are incentivized to make this less complicated?
No.
Okay. So we are acting within a world where it is complicated. It will remain complicated. And it's just about how you adapt to that and potentially, deploy technology to try and help you navigate it.
This is where Lars, as a behavioral, almost a behavioral scientist, and this is much better at explaining it, but I would posit, and then Lars can pick up on it. That if you have a system where you've got a gigantic revenue stream coming in that most of your customers don't even bother to audit because they can't, where is the incentive for you to do something about it?
Correct.
And on top of that, I think we're missing a key stakeholder. We're talking about this as it's purely BCO versus carrier. Let's not forget, for a lot of them, there's a freight forwarder, and often that freight forwarder would have more free time with the carrier than what they're given to the BCO. And it is in their interest to also play in that space.
Well, one of the things that we found is that there's a level of automation to this that we can get to. But I think the important first step is decision support. I mean, you've both mentioned like who, what, where, when, who's responsible, etc. And surfacing insight around detention demurrage, perhaps over cost or last free day or what's dwelling where, and having an oversight of like, there's a burning problem here in Antwerp, like let's go and focus on that. It's that level of decision support that we first want to get to enable people to take better ownership over the problem, right? If they're not monitoring it or collating it in a analytical way, it's very, very hard to like manage it, right? So I think that's the first step to get towards. One of the things that we landed upon when building this was that the treasure trove is in the unstructured data, right? Milestone information, very, very structured, discharge plus one, the ATAs, all that stuff that we know and love. I think what we tried to focus on, and generative AI was something that completely unlocked this, was how do you incorporate the freight contract, right? That is either on the BCO side or the freight forwarding side, but it's very unstructured in nature. It changes quite regularly. Even if it's a named account or FAK, we're seeing a high turnover and cadence of the changes of how these contracts and tariffs are deployed. So we wanted to go there because we think that it solves further upstream the problem of how you're managing the freight contract. I mean, Bjorn, have you seen in the past, like, because you've actually spoken yourself about procurement of freight contracts and locking in long-term rates, etc. But give us an idea of the number of these things like out there and how often they can change.
You mean the demurrage and detention in the context of procurement? There are two things that I have done over the years, over many years actually, is you can negotiate. There are two levers you can pull as a negotiator. You can negotiate on free time, and you can negotiate on the per diem as well. If you have a reasonable size, you are not necessarily, especially on detention, you are not necessarily bound by the per diems in the carrier's tariff. Carriers can be flexible on that. I've negotiated or made it a price of entry into my tenders that the global per diem, I don't care where I incur that detention, the global per diem is X dollars per day. I've typically asked my stakeholders, and this is for the BCOs out there setting up tenders, I've asked my internal stakeholders to submit their requirements for free time. Then I've challenged them, because this is important. If you ask people how much free time do you want, they'll invariably say 30 days, 40 days, 50 days. In some countries, believe it or not, that's actually quite legit. Thinking especially Brazil, for example, notorious for being impossible to clear within a certain amount of time. But what I've always done, and BCO should really do this before they open that door, they should understand that free time is not free. Okay, you'll find that cost somewhere.
Exactly.
Right? If you ask for too much. So the key is to go and be reasonable with the carrier, but argue with data to say, listen, I know, because I have a visibility system from whatever service provider I have, a pretty good idea of what my dwell time really is at every individual final destination point. I know what my dwell time is in Brazil. I know what my dwell time is in Los Angeles, in the warehouse. I'm talking about the warehouse, the final destination, right? I know what they are on average. So if a stakeholder comes and says, I want 30 days free time, and you can go back and say, dude, you've received 200 shipments this year, 200 bills of lading. One of them stood there for longer than 10 days. The rest, you have a 4-day turnaround. Try again, and then you go back to the carrier and demonstrate that you've done that work with all of your stakeholders, and you have no choice but to ask here for this 30-day free time, which is very rare, right? You will get it. Right, because there's a pretty good chance that if you've done your homework and you reach that conclusion, that there are many, many other BCOs at the same destination who have the same problem. Right. So that's what you can actively do. Be reasonable, be structured, argue with data to the carrier for what you want, but don't ask for what you don't need.
Correct.
Because it's not free. Yeah, sure, but I can get you 60 days free time, but your rate's going to be $2,000 higher than what you need, and you're never ever going to use it, right?
But I guess that behavior is stemmed from, for a BCO, an unplanned cost is kind of where heads roll, right? Like that's
but the money has to be really, really big before heads roll. That's the thing. That's the problem.
Okay.
Really, right. The other thing I really want to stress is that this global universal per diem can work. You need to have a certain size to ask for it, but it is done. Now, that I'm afraid for. I'm on the receiving end of some of those. So I speak with authority when I say it's done, not just because I did it, but now I see those requirements coming back on myself. So it's a real thing. Those are the two things you can do. Negotiate the cost and only ask for what you really need, and be prepared to prove to your service providers that you don't ask just because you can, but because you have a good reason, and here it is. That's what you can do.
Sure. I want to cut to technology. We're going to demonstrate our platform and our module very, very shortly. And maybe just teeing Emma up into this, because it's going to be quite a large portion of the webinar, and we also want to go through it. We want to get questions from everyone online as well. And also Bjorn, Lars, like if there's something in here that you're not seeing, like let's talk about how we can potentially do it. Before we do that, though, what we have found through this journey of trying to deploy a Gen AI native tool is we've landed on significant ROI capabilities. And if you take the forward lens for a moment, the cash flow benefit of understanding what your exposure is on D&D, because a typical behavior is that the freight invoice won't be billed out until the D&D invoice is known from the carrier. So how do you compress that time, and how do you invoice that out as one go? That we found that the unpaid accounts payable back to the carrier as well was also a large sort of treasure trove of cash that is sat there that isn't that hasn't been dealt with. So I think those are the types of things that we want to lean into. But before we do, Bjorn, Lars, have you seen anything out there? AI is like everywhere, obviously, but have you seen anything out there AI related, and how it's actually going to try and solve the detention demurrage problem? Or is that just you haven't seen that yet?
I haven't seen it yet. I can't rule out that I mean, I know in my last gig with Cummins, we were seriously discussing going down that route. It was actually why you and I had a meeting in London to see what the answer to it. We never actually got down there. If we had that idea by ourselves, I'd be very surprised if other BCOs haven't had that idea internally. I think the problem they would run into, which is the one we ran into, which is why you and I had the meeting, is they don't have the data.
Yeah.
Right. Even the raw data. Right.
Yeah. Quite right.
It's probably all kinds of people are tinkering with it out there, but I've not seen a tool or a public system platform that offers anything.
Cool. Lars, any comments on that before we sort of open the system and check it out?
No, I think Bjorn said it all quite well.
Cool. Okay. So let's move on then. Emma, I'm going to hand over to yourself. And yeah, we appreciate you sort of walking us through this. We're going to open the system. This is the newest tool that Windward has built. It's Gen AI native. It was a hell of a journey for us to get here. So yeah, Emma, I'm going to leave it to yourself, and let's see, like amongst all of us, how we can interact with the system as Emma sort of walks us through it.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so please feel free to drop any questions as we're moving through the demonstration. I just want to, before we dive into some of the features and functionality of the system, sort of set the scene in terms of where we were when we started exploring this product and how we get to this point where we have all of the data in the system in this nice structured manner, because I think it's a bit of a disservice if we don't talk about how we get to this point. So when we started exploring detention and demurrage, the common things that were coming up were, I'm managing it on a spreadsheet, and it's really hard to understand when every carrier is charging slightly differently and every port is different. There's massive regulatory differences globally. How do I know when to start my calculation? Is it on the discharge? Is it on the actual time of arrival? All of these intricacies that we see play out across detention and demurrage. So we went to the drawing board and started thinking about, well, how do we apply technology to solve this? And with the advent of generative AI in 2022, it seemed like now was the right time to sort of tackle a problem of this size and apply an appropriate technology with generative AI. So when you decide to move forward with this product, what happens is all of the contracts are sent to our team, and we don't need templates anymore. Gone are those days of trying to manage data in predefined templates and manage it that way. We take PDFs and Excel files, emails even, and we get all of that raw data. We then upload it to a large language model, which is the foundation of technology behind generative AI. And it is trained by and reviewed by a logistics agent, which we have pre-trained with around about 10 years worth of logistics knowledge, specifically in the detention and demurrage range. And then it is able to extract all of those nuances and all of those terms written in natural language, and it takes them all out and it structures them so that it then becomes a consumable data source. I just wanted to talk about that before we go into the features. I think it's quite an important point to understand why this solution is slightly different, and we believe the correct approach compared to other products that have tried to tackle detention and demurrage previously. So I'm going to just quickly now walk us through the system. So here we have all of the shipments that are currently being run through our detention and demurrage module. We have a lot of information in here that is around important data points for how we apply a tariff and make sure that we have the correct tariff. And we have our milestone data here. Now, just a brief moment on this. You can purchase the milestone data via Windward, or we also enable you to upload your own milestone data. We're very conscious that carriers have gaps in some of their data points, especially around the empty return. But a lot of our customers have in-house haulage teams that have a really good grip on that data point. So we do enable you to also add your own data as well. We have available via our API information on the mapping to contracts. So very important that we map each container to the correct contracts so that we're applying the correct rates, and we can surface back errors on those contracts if they're not mapped correctly. So it's a continual process of data improvement and data quality to make sure that we're maximizing the coverage on these calculations for you.
And Emma, we've already pre-baked in all of the standard carrier tariffs, right?
We have. So if the tariff is an open source tariff that's available via online via one of the carriers, we have actually pre-baked that into the system. And there's two different ways you can apply that. Firstly, you can instruct us to tell us to apply the standard tariff, or you can actually enable a fallback mechanism where if you don't give us a contract, we can automatically apply that as well. And so all of that contract management and making sure that relevant updates are applied, that all then becomes part of the Windward solution, and that's no longer needed on your side.
Cool.
So just I'm going to double click into one shipment here and just look at some of the features. So there are 4 different tariff types that we support currently. So we've got demurrage fees, carrier storage fees, detention fees, and also combined detention and demurrage. We do present at both a buy and a sell rate. Very aware that whether it's freight forwarder or BCO, it really can vary in terms of whether there are both internal and external stakeholders. So we wanted to enable that functionality so that is available if you do have both a buy and a sell rate. I'm just going to double click on this instance where we have some storage fees here. And you can see how what we've done here is broken down what was in the contract into a consumable table. So in this instance, there was 5 free days on the carrier storage, so there are no fees applicable. And then there are 2 days where the fees are applicable, and that's resulted in a €100 charge. We do actually link all of the tariffs, whether it's your own tariff, an FAK tariff, or a named account tariff, or whether it's one of those open source tariffs. We will actually link that within the solution as well, so that you can manage your contracts via the solution. Just jumping down to the buy rates. One interesting thing I did want to show is with this little icon here. Again, this is just another way for us to surface back to the users those interesting intricacies of contracts. So in this instance, we can see that it was determined in that contract that all calendar days are included except for the start date. And we will also highlight things there like working days versus calendar days, so that we still are enabling that visibility of the contract terms. At a very high level, we do also show a breakdown on the buy and sell for the free time, and then also for those tiered pricings as well. So I want to talk, if I've got time, yes, I have, just about a couple of some of the use cases that we are solving for and how we're working with our clients. One of the things that's been mentioned a lot, especially by Bjorn, is around the over procurement of free time. So when we've been out in the market speaking to our clients, you know, really common for us to hear, well, we don't really know how to procure because we don't have visibility over all of the detention and demurrage that we're spending. So then it becomes very difficult to make a data-driven decision. Going back to it really exactly what Bjorn said. So with one of our clients, we were able to work with them and highlight that they were over procuring on their detention and demurrage. 70% of their shipments were actually moved off of the port within 3 days. However, they were purchasing 10 days free. And as everybody's mentions and knows, 3 days aren't really free. There is a cost there somewhere. So helping driving cost savings at a very high level when it comes to procurement and contract management. The other thing I did want to talk about as well is one of the other big areas that we're discussing with clients that Joe mentioned is around the accounts payable processing. A lot of our clients were telling us, you know, the cost of the business on average for processing an invoice that can't be automatically matched is around about $50. And, you know, we're having thousands of invoices move through the system. So I do just want to introduce a generative AI agent that we actually apply on top of the data within the system. Now we have some for our visibility offering, but in this instance, I'm going to click on the fees explanation, which is the explanation for our buy rate on the detention and demurrage. And so this is a breakdown and an understanding of where the charges have come from on the buy side. And we have clients that are actually using this as backing to automatically or semi-automatically reject carrier invoices, to just support with things like improving cash flow and making sure that everything that can be rejected is, and we're plugging any revenue leakage. You know, one of the things that we hear very often is around the impact of if you're not correctly managing your supplier invoices and they withdraw credit facility, what an impact that can also have on a business.
I guess also, Emma, the use case here is that if you're a freight forwarder and you want to explain it back to the BCO, like why these charges are applied and what's happened, then it could also just accompany that invoice or at least be shared with an email. I mean, I don't know, Bjorn, if you've had instances where you've just been saddled with an enormous bill and there's just very little context to it.
I think depending on the enormity of that bill, I wouldn't pay it until I had all the context.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't give you a number, what's the threshold for that, but it would be, if we're well over $100,000, which is absolutely not uncommon. At that point, I listen, when I see some context and a really good explanation, I'll consider paying this bill. Until then, absolutely no way. And different BCOs can set that levels differently, right? But again, the vast majority of BCOs I know of pay the bill because, I mean, they know at a certain level, they know they kept the container for longer than they should. This they know, right? And they just sort of go, okay, we're guilty. I guess that's the number. Then okay, it sounds horrible, but
yeah,
true.
Yeah,
it is what it is.
I think what we've also learned through this product, though, is that although that is an instance of the BCO, the forwarders are actually absorbing costs as well. So whether or not, you know, that's common practice, we do find that if it's been poorly managed by the forwarder, or it hasn't been invoiced on time, or it hasn't been explained in the right sort of context, there is a case where the BCO is just going to pull the freight, right? Like, okay, they always hold it over the forwarder that I can just move my cargo with someone else here. So
Yeah.
there's
And it can also happen that a named account or an account of a forwarder,
right.
and this I know, right? Because now I'm wearing that hat, asks for free time that the forwarder simply does not have available, but that the forwarder agrees to that free time, thinking, okay, it all comes out in the wash. I'll make the money somewhere else, and my total margin on the shipment will be acceptable, right? So in which case the forwarder would absolutely, as you point out, absorb those extra free days that they couldn't negotiate.
Yeah.
So
We've actually we've had a question, and I think it's a very interesting one around the buy and sell rate meaning. And happy for anyone else to elaborate on it, but I'll give it a first stab. So we do see that in some forwarding instances that a forwarder will buy the detention demurrage tariff or rate with a particular carrier, but there could be a different sell rate back to the customer if there is a blended outcome from the use of multiple carriers, just to standardize how detention demurrage is actually being handled back to the customer as opposed to a fragmented multitude of different carriers. So that's what we mean by that, and hopefully that sort of answers the question.
yeah, I mean, there can be cases. This is going back to what I said earlier about negotiating global per diems. I can't say about that some of the really big top 3, 4, 5 forwarders have done that, right? And you could sit here and argue, well, that's not fair because it should be a pass-through cost, and some of them are. Port storage, for example, is potentially a pass-through.
Right.
On the other hand, in many cases, the forwarder, the agent, is being asked to absorb other costs, for example, in granting a much longer free time than they have on hand to themselves or elsewhere. At the end of the day, the customer will make its decision on a total cost of the shipment. And I think it's quite dangerous if we, and even as a BCO, I tried not to do that. It's very dangerous when you start picking apart the individual constituents or components of a freight quote.
Yeah.
To minimize every single one of them is not going to work, right? So I don't find it particularly controversial that there are instances where a forwarder pays the carrier less than they bill the customer. It all comes out in the wash.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Lars.
maybe also to add to this, I mean, Bjorn, you were mentioning the word whether something is fair or not fair. At the end of the day, detention it's a commercial product being sold out there, and it can be sold at different prices. And when we talk about, for example, the detention problem, I don't see detention as the problem itself. It's the management of detention where some then lose track of what is this going to cost.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Emma, thank you very much for the demo. If you could just close your screen, that's great, because we're coming towards the end now. But I just maybe wanted to just firstly recap on the technology there that Emma's talked us through. Our approach to this was very much to tackle the unstructured nature of freight contracts, the turnover of them, and the management of them, to make sure that the terms of that contract are deployed across the organization, the operation, to make sure that everyone's clear when that invoice comes in, or indeed if you have to bill out the application of D&D, that it's very, very transparent. We also realize that the application of this, particularly for BCOs, can just sit over particular countries, manufacturing plants, large import regions, to give an immediate oversight in a P&L fashion, like where are you bleeding, right? I think that's really, really important, that we find that some BCOs can't quite locate where the leaky bucket is, and applying something like this would definitely provide a fix. On the forwarder side, I think it's all around transparency and communication. And that is why we've built generative AI agents that sit on top of that to provide additional context. And we haven't even got into the point where the automation of these calculations is driving huge benefits, because if I think back to my forwarding days, like just sitting down to troubleshoot what's occurred on a shipment and how to actually build the calculation ahead of telling a customer, this could be hours and hours and hours of work. So the automation element of what we've provided here is is also a huge benefit to operational efficiencies. So maybe just then in closing and just to sort of round off, I think we've touched on so many different reasons for D&D, the role that geopolitical and disruptive events cause and the downward effect it causes on detention and demurrage. But perhaps, Lars, is the future bright? Is it just going to be as dull and as difficult as ever? What are your thoughts in terms of 3-5 years where this goes? Now that you've seen an application that's gonna help solve the problem.
Yeah, I mean, maybe with the risk of being slightly cheeky, it's not going to solve the problem because it's
Right.
not a problem to be solved. It's a problem to be managed.
Quite right.
And in order to manage a problem, an absolute key is having real-time information so you can do something. And that is definitely a large step towards helping to manage it. I mean, if you get $100,000 detention bill, well, that's trying to close the barn after the horses have already escaped. So it's a matter of getting that real-time information. Where are you leaking so you can do something before it becomes a problem that runs out of control?
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're quite right. It was almost an oversight in this discussion that we're not going to get to the actual root cause of the issue here. I think it's always going to play its part when we have localized port congestion, changes in tariffs, port strikes, etc. That's always going to play into an outcome of detention demurrage. I think our role here is to remain agile in the face of the industry wide problem. But no, good point. Bjorn, what about yourself? Like any closing thoughts, remarks?
Well, they echo Lars. I mean, to manage the problem, you must first understand that this can offer some understanding. The experience I have trying to manage and understand these very clearly highlight that within your typical BCO organization, you have the usual suspects. It's the same 3 plants or the same 3 warehouses where the problem always occurs.
Right.
The problem, you don't know which those same 3 are. You just don't know, right? And or maybe you know who you think they are, but you don't know whether it's actually another 3 out there that you have no visibility on that are the real problem that dwarf the 3 main culprits you think you know, right? This is really, and that's why I keep using that phrase, a dark hole, because it really is a black hole. Tools like this can absolutely shine a light into that black hole, and that's, I think, how adopters should use it, right? Try and understand where are your real pain points, where are the leaks, and can I or should I stop it, or is it okay that that leak exists here because the alternative, the cost of fixing the leak in the shape of a bigger warehouse or more doors or whatever is actually much higher than what I'm paying. So it's not to solve the problem, it's to understand the problem, and in some cases to understand whether it even is.
Yes.
So, right.
Thank you for that, Bjorn, and I appreciate your inputs as well, Lars. We've come right up to time. We have a few questions that have already been populated in the webinar itself, which we are happy to get to and also share responses to the wider audience. This was recorded. It will be shared with everyone that's attended and those that couldn't make it as well. But I think just in closing, we're delighted to have shared our new tool and our new functionality around detention demurrage. Thank you for attending. Stay in touch. Find me on LinkedIn, find Emma, find our CEO, anyone at Windward that you want to discuss this problem with. And we look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Everybody.